Well, the problem with that is up at the beginning, there were maybe some words you didn't recognize that you skipped over, something like dextrose or maltose or brown rice syrup or corn syrup. These are all different words that all mean sugar. And in fact, on US food labels, there are over 60 different descriptors that all mean sugar's been added. Over 65% of all the barcoded food in the US contains just such sweeteners. And in fact, again, many of these could be a power bar, granola bar with labels that say natural or healthy. And so if in the construction of that granola bar, they use brown rice syrup and corn syrup and sugar, each of these are listed individual by their respective weights. Altogether, a majority of that packaged product may actually be constructed of sugar. And finally, the last caveat in that is when you do look at the sugar content, again, go back to that per serving. That's often how it's displayed, and it is displayed that way again at the in at the determination of the manufacturer as to what actually constitutes a serving. Some things that are exempt from food labeling, vegetables and fruit, I think for pretty obvious reasons. They're they're real products, and so they're just too variable to have to undergo the rigors of labeling. Most people aren't aware that fish and seafood is exempt from labeling by the FDA as well. That can be important when you consider that over 90% of the seafood consumed in the United States is actually imported, and also exempt from FDA labeling. So moving on beyond the required labeling from the FDA into all these claims that we see on the labels, essentially the marketing and the advertisings that go on those labels. We often see things like natural. So it's a natural product. It's a natural ham. What exactly does that mean? Doodly squat. It absolutely has no real legal meaning. Again, the FDA does have some guidelines in place, some policies, etc., but it's just something that's not enforced. And what's also important to remember that the FDA doesn't look down or prevent anybody from using the term natural if they use pesticides, if they use herbicides like Roundup. How they process it. None of this really concerns the FDA about people using the term natural. And I mentioned the term, for example, natural ham, and you might think, oh, well, that means that the pork, was raised on a pasture, it was well taken care of, they didn't use any sorts of antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera. No, the natural when it comes to meats actually is a reference to the USDA regulations, and that only applies to how the meat is processed after slaughter. So when you're in the meat case and you see natural Angus beef, that has absolutely nothing to do with how that animal was raised, the constituents, the composition of the meats, etc. It only has to do with how it was processed. So that can be a bit tricky there and deceptive. Local, we throw around the term local all the time. I use it, and to be fair, in the culinary world, local actually does have some meaning. So when chefs talk about locally sourcing, we are generally referring to anywhere from 50 up to about 125 miles. We kind of consider that where you are to be locally sourcing. But as far as locals on the label or, local in a supermarket, it has zero meaning, zero legal liability. And in fact, an expose in Florida some years ago showed that what some folks were doing was going to buy produce, for example, tomatoes that had actually been rejected by the supermarket. They were misshapen, they had bumps and bruises. There was what we might call the ugly fruit, and they would buy that at a discount. And then they'd go to a farmer's market, put up a little hand done sign on cardboard that said local tomatoes, and sell them at a price higher than what the supermarket was charging. Because there's no law or regulation about local. So if you don't know where it comes from locally, you might want to be wary about that when it's being pitched to you. Whole. We talk about Whole Foods, right? We have a whole supermarket chain called Whole Foods. What does Whole Foods mean in terms of any kind of legally binding contract with us as a consumer? It means a whole lot of nothing. So when we talk about Whole Foods legally, again, when people put that on a label, when companies put that on a label, they're not to be held to any kind of standard or requirement. So when it comes to Whole Foods, there's really no such thing as Whole Foods. Now, some things like whole grains actually do have a specific meaning. So this actually comes from a third-party source, something called the Whole Grains Council, and we'll be talking about third-party verification just a little bit later in our program today. But whole grains basically means that if we call something a whole grain, then it contains all elements of that cereal grain before it underwent milling, sifting, any kind of processing. And those components are the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. And they are in that bread or that flour, whatever it is, in the same ratio that you would find them in the native unprocessed cereal grain. So whole grains definitely do mean something. Unfortunately, when we look, for example, at a bag of bread and we see something that says multigrain, it may say healthy multigrain bread. Oh, and you're thinking, oh, well, that means something. It says it's healthy. It says it's got multigrains. That means I'm getting that good fiber, that bran, etc. No, it doesn't. That actually means nothing. So multigrain just means they used more than wheat. So there could be some oat flakes on the top that would concentrate as that would be considered a multigrain bread. 12 grain, again, doesn't mean anything healthy. Made from wheat flour, it can be, bleached, industrially produced, highly refined white flour. That is a type of wheat flour. Wheat bread, again, that same bleached, highly milled, highly processed wheat flour, white bread, it's a form of wheat bread. Made with whole grains means nothing. Even 100% wheat, which immediately we start to think, oh, that means whole wheat, whole grain. Not necessarily. It just means it's wheat. That's what's on the label. So again, there's no guarantee of any kind of benefit there. Made with whole wheat, contains bran and multigrain, nothing. High fiber. High fiber, again, holds the producer of that to no kind of legal standard. There are, and if you get anything from this talk at all today, know these two phrases next time you're shopping for bread or you're shopping for a grain product, a wheat product in the store. 100% whole wheat and whole grain whole wheat. Those are the two phrases in the United States, because every country around the world has different standards. But in the US, 100% whole wheat, that means something. Whole grain whole wheat means something. 100% whole grain whole wheat, that means something. So those two phrases right there, that means you are getting that whole grain whole wheat that we talked about in the definition that I gave to you just a few moments ago from the Whole Grains Council. When we talk about grass-fed, this is very common these days. Again, what we like to envision is a happy cow living its life in leisure, in good spirit, munching away, and fields of grass. That's what we like to envision. What does grass-fed mean? Essentially nothing. So again, there is a legally defined requirement by the USDA, their kind of enforcement and inspection arm, the FSIS, but the actual production practices vary greatly. Producers really only have to sign an affidavit saying, yeah, we promise we're on the honor system. So coming across something that says grass-fed really doesn't mean anything. Many people think that, oh, well, if it says grass finished, that means something, but that really doesn't mean that it received and ate only grass its entire life, and only means it was finished on grass. So it could have been fed grains, etc., prior to being finished on grass. So what actually has meaning is the term grass-fed and grass-finished, which is also referred to as 100% grass-fed. And that means that the cattle ate grass or hay in the winter, a forage diet, their entire lives. Now, realize that that doesn't mean that they lived out in the pasture. That simply means that's what they were fed. There are, and we'll get to those third-party verifications that will assure us about how the animal was raised as well. But grass-fed and grass-finished, or 100% grass-fed, specifically refers to the diet of the cattle. How about just the term pastured or pasture raised? Again, we like to think of those animals being, humanely treated, living good lives out in the free spaces of the ranches and the farms. But unfortunately, that has no legal meaning whatsoever. So when you see that on a package, it doesn't necessarily mean anything when it says either pasture raised or just pastured. Cage free, you'll see this a lot on the eggs. They'll charge you more for it. And what we think of when we read cage free, well, that's that picture on the left. Again, we're thinking of those chickens having a grand old time just scratching around the farmyard. In reality, and this was part of a New York Times expose that was published fairly recently, and we'll get into the details of that in the closing of our program today. But cage free just means they're not in a cage. And so in reality, many of these operations keep the birds under what we would consider very stressful, not necessarily humane and the best conditions, where they are totally crammed together in tight quarters in confined areas on top of one another. But because they don't spend their entire lives in individual cages, they can be called cage free, and you can have cage free chickens or cage free eggs as well as a result of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they live their lives as those chickens on the left hand side of that picture do. No antibiotics added. This is a favorite one. I see it more and more. And again, this has some legal meaning, not from the FDA, which again is the body that is responsible for our food packaging labeling laws, but from the USDA, FSIS, or their kind of enforcement arm. Again, there are some legal requirements there, but in point of fact, there's no enforcement of these claims. And again, this is another claim that ranchers and farmers and growers and producers can put on their products if they sign an affidavit saying, hey, I didn't do any of this. There's no kind of inspection system in place to verify any of this information outside of third-party verifications. It's also worth noting that this is a bit of, a little bit of a kind of trickery in marketing, if you will, because the law requires that any animal that gets antibiotics must undergo a certain withdrawal period before you can sell the milk from cows or sheep or so forth, or before they're brought to slaughter and harvested. So in speaking for the regular consumer, we really shouldn't be getting any antibiotics in our food because technically they have to undergo this withdrawal period. So this whole idea of advertising and charging you as a consumer more because there's no antibiotics, administered is a form of advertising that's often referred to as greenwashing. When you see labels covered with things like no antibiotics added, pastured, cage-free, that have very, very or no legal meaning whatsoever. Humane is another one that falls under that category of greenwashing outside of third-party verification. Again, that New York Times article I referred to revealed that a lot, because there are no standards, a lot of people, again, who sign the affidavit or who sell their meats as humanely raised, so that you as a consumer can buy it feeling good, maybe in fact paying more for that product, that these animals are raised in confinement, conditions, that are less, one would say, than humane. And I talked about verification. So let's move on to that as we wrap this up. There are governmental verifications. The most potent, powerful one for our purposes in terms of discussion today is organic. It has specific criteria. There are certain verification systems in place. There's auditing, there is meeting of minimal requirements, and there is, most importantly, legal meaning. Most folks are unfamiliar that there are 3 different types of organic. There's 100% organic, so completely organic. So we might have a 100% organic apple that can carry that organic seal. We have something labeled organic, and with at least 95% of what that product is organic. And so we might have applesauce that's labeled organic because 95% of the ingredients or more are organic. Both of those will carry the organic seal. And then you'll see things that are labeled made with organic ingredients. And that's not quite the same bar as the first two. Up to about a third of whatever makes up that product can be conventional. And importantly, that last category is not allowed to contain or display the organic seal. So you can see that right up here on the left-hand side, that's that organic seal. And that often will be accompanied by third-party verifications like the Non-GMO Project. Here you see the Non-GMO Project verified seal. And what we have to remember about these third-party verifications, they're great, but you have to know what they're verifying and what their criteria are. So for example, the Non-GMO Project, you can go to the website, you can read about what it is that they're verifying, what their standards are, and what allows that product to then bear that seal. But once we understand that, once we go there, that can be very, very helpful in helping us differentiate some of the pretenders from the real thing when we're shelling out, our valuable dollars in search of those quality, wholesome ingredients. This is another third-party verification. I was talking just a little bit ago about grass-fed. Well, if you see this seal by the AGW, which is also run by the Certified Animal Welfare Approved Group, and it says certified grass-fed by AGW, that seal guarantees that the animals were 100% grass-fed for life. They underwent high standards of humane treatment. They were pastured outside on a range or on the farm, and that those farms that bear those seals undergo annual audits to make sure that they meet those standards. So that's very, very important. And we've got just a few minutes left, so I want to wrap that up. Again, emphasizing that the definitions of what one third party considers humane may vary, in some cases, quite a bit from what others do. So we want to be aware of these different organizations. This is part of the expose I was talking about from the New York Times. So we have the American Humane Society, the Humane Farm Animal Care, and the Animal Welfare Approved that I just showed you their grass-fed certification from. All 3 organizations will put a stamp of approval and certify humane treatment. But if we look at things like their pork products, for example, the American Humane Association allows tail docking, which is cutting off the tail of the pigs so that they don't bite each other. And that's a practice that some people may not consider humane. And for example, the AWA prohibits that. The AWA also requires almost twice as much space as American Humane Association does when these animals are kept inside. When we look at cattle, the Animal Welfare Group requires that the animals always have access to pasture, but the American Humane Society and the other group do not require that before slaughter. So again, that means that those animals can be subject to stress. They can be in very, what we might consider not so humane environments right before they are harvested and going to slaughter. Yet something like that might carry a grass-fed label, even though it was finished on grains. It may carry an American Humane Certified label, even though the environment in which it lived for the last several weeks of its life prior to slaughter were, what some may consider less than humane. Chickens, if you're ever driven down I-81 in Virginia, as you get west of DC, you will come across where they raise the Tyson chickens, and you will smell them. You will not see them, but you will smell that ammonia as you drive down the highway. And if you can smell that 10 miles off the beaten path on the highway, you can imagine what the conditions are that those chickens are existing in. And you can see different criteria for allowances of that ammonia, and also for the health of the birds. Chickens are often exposed to as much light as possible because it speeds their growth. And you see the AHA only requires 4 hours of darkness, where the AWA requires twice that amount in terms of the health of the birds. And finally, when we're looking at egg producing poultry or nesting hens, we look at something like beak trimming, and the AHA may allow that. That's where, because there's a pecking order at feeding time, the people who run those operations will actually cut the beaks off the chickens so they can't peck each other. The AWA doesn't allow that, the AHA does. So I know I've run just a minute or two over time. Thank you so much with bearing with me today. We went through that powerful whirlwind tour of truth in advertising, which no doubt may have left you a little bit discouraged, but fear not. Hopefully now you are a much wiser, much smarter sorcerer, and you're getting to understand that art of sorcery. You're the Harry Potter beginning level wizard when you go out there to source your ingredients. Again, this is something that we cover in depth in our course, much more discussion, etc. about that. Quite honestly, this can be a course in and of itself. But if you'd like to see more about these and maybe some specifics, feel free to let us know. Thank you so much for your attention today. And I hope this has helped make you a more confident, smarter, and more savvy shopper.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.